Good evening, everyone. Good evening and welcome to the Friday evening lecture at the Center for Ethics and Culture Fall Conference. My name is Gladden Pappin. I am an assistant professor of politics at the University of Dallas, permanent research fellow and senior advisor of the Center for Ethics and Culture. We're very honored to have with us this evening James Hankins, professor of history at Harvard University, where he has been on the faculty since 1985. Professor Hankins is the central figure in scholarship on Renaissance intellectual history and Neo-Latin literature, indeed one of the most distinguished scholars alive today in any field. When I first met him as a sophomore at Harvard College, while taking his course on the history of the soul, I had the impression of a man whose intellectual labors were unceasing. This impression was confirmed for me one Wednesday afternoon when I went to visit his office hours. His office was in the library at Widener Library. And with a little trepidation, I went up to the second floor of the library and wound my way around to Widener S272, walked up the additional level of stairs, knocked on the door, "Come in," and I asked meekly, "Am I interrupting you?" And a figure turned around from his desk and said, "Of course you're interrupting me." The tables have turned now, though. As Jim was finishing his second article for my journal, American Affairs, last month, the October 5th deadline came and went without the submission of an essay. But on the morning of October 6th, I received the following email. "Sorry I am late with the American Affairs article. It should be done today or tomorrow. I think it's good stuff. I was thinking of asking for an extension, but the irony was too intense." So Jim Hankins' impact on the study of Renaissance humanism, political thought, the history of philosophy, and the history of the classical tradition would be hard to overestimate. His work traverses philosophy, politics, textual criticism, paleography, history, literature. He's brought to light what he has often called the lost continent of Latin literature. He founded and is the general editor of the Itati Renaissance Library, which he began in 1998 together with Walter Kaiser, described as the only series that makes available to a broad readership the major literary, historical, philosophical, and scientific works of the Italian Renaissance written in Latin. Since its first volume appeared in 2001, the ITRL has grown to include 86 volumes. For those keeping track, a pace of more than 5 per year, or what we would call in Notre Dame parlance a hurry-up offense. In his spare time, he has published as an author or editor almost 150 articles, monographs, and edited collections. He's been the associate editor of the Catalogus Translationum et Commentarium since 2003, as well as a member of the Institute for the Advanced Study at Princeton, a recipient of the Rome Prize of the American Academy in Rome. And in 2012, he received the Paul Oscar Christeller Lifetime Achievement Award of the Renaissance Society of America. In 2014, he was elected a corresponding fellow of the British Academy. He's also a Renaissance man himself, and students at Harvard may know him best for the long-running Hankins Wine Seminar, a designation which surely makes him apt as a speaker for the Center for Ethics and Culture. We're very proud then at last that Jim will also be joining the Center for Ethics and Culture this spring as a senior distinguished research fellow. Please join me in welcoming Jim Hankins.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm now desperately searching through my memory to wonder if I ever gave him a B. I don't think so, actually. All right. I was trying to think of a joke to begin this presentation with, but it's on tyranny and totalitarianism, so it's not easy to strike a comic mode, so I'm just going to jump right in. My subject is political evil and the radical corruption of political life that, since ancient times, in the West has been called tyranny. The most extreme form of tyranny, modern tyranny, has also been called totalitarianism. And whether totalitarianism is the terrifying fulfillment of ancient philosophers' dream, as Karl Popper wrote in The Open Society and Its Enemies, or something radically new, or continuation in some way of ancient tyranny, is a subject of debate among political philosophers and other philosophers. I'm not going to engage that debate tonight as a philosopher. I'm not a philosopher. I'm an intellectual historian. I love philosophers, mostly because they're smarter than I am, but they need historians now and again to straighten them out, fill in a few blanks that they're unaware of. Anyway, so first, however, I want to clarify the nature of the phenomenon I'm addressing. By tyranny, I mean a particular form of political dysfunction that has been repeated over and over again in Western history in more or less severe forms. It's a phenomenon that was most profoundly analyzed in Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, a book that shows how the problem of political evil runs through every human heart and has to be conquered in every human soul. It marks our kind of moral paralysis among the political class. Citizens are under surveillance from the government and live in fear of denunciation. The government lies and deceives as a matter of policy. There's an absence of free and open debate, an absence of the relationship of philia, a friendship among the political elite, which Aristotle thought was the real basis for a healthy polity. Tyranny's world is one where, among those in power, courage is hard to find, trust hides its face, and love is dangerous. It's often historically been accompanied by acts of spectacular cruelty and violence committed by the public power, which emphasize its arbitrary nature and are intended to silence dissent and break the spirit of opposition. In modern times, tyranny has often been accompanied by artificial famines, terror, murder on an industrial scale. According to the Black Book of Communism, which is a book weirdly published by Harvard University Press in 1997, I think nowadays they wouldn't publish it. The Black Book of Communism numbers the victims of totalitarian tyranny in communist countries during the 17th century as 94 million. The warning signs of this tyranny, as we know from many historical examples, are extreme partisanship, such that one party wants to delegitimate, exile, or destroy the other one, and there's paralysis in the state's decision-making process, and real deliberation and compromise are disabled by social and ideological hatreds. I think we can all recognize some of those warning signs in our own political culture. Well, more than a century ago, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, Westerners flattered themselves that this type of system had been finally defeated, and liberal democracy and freedom were breaking out all over. History had reached its end, said Francis Fukuyama, and we were it. In the last few years, however, there's been a growing realization that the tyrannical impulse has not been defeated, and that liberal democracy increasingly has been taking on some of the worst aspects of totalitarianism. In fact, the elites of liberal democratic societies are no longer committed either to liberalism or to democracy. We've had arguments to this effect in 3 recent books, all published 2016. Richard Legutkov's The Demon in Democracy, Todd Wietzinger's The New Totalitarian Temptation, and Waller Newell's Tyrants, A History of Power, Injustice, and Terror. Newell's book hasn't received the attention it deserves. It's a popular book. It has a somewhat commercial title, and it's not particularly profound or comprehensive, but it does draw attention to the increasing problem in liberal democracies and the resemblance of those liberal democracies to tyrannies in history. So my project tonight is also historical, although unlike Newell, I'm going to approach my task analytically rather than chronologically. I'm going to pose a series of historical questions that I hope will open up the question of political evil and lead us to a clear understanding of the special nature of the tyranny of modern times. My assumption is that deepening our historical understanding of tyranny will help us grasp how the modern form of tyranny, millenarian tyranny, if I want to use Newell's term, came about, and why it's still hard to defeat despite the harrowing experiences of the 20th century, which should have taught everybody that the problems with ideological tyranny, but they haven't. History also gives us this comfort that tyranny has been defeated before, and history also offers us the counsel about ways to defeat it. The most important way to defeat ideological tyranny, I'll claim later, is through serious moral education, the kind of moral education which Solzhenitsyn experiences involuntarily in the Gulag Archipelago. It's an education that cuts through society's indoctrination, rejects its willed ignorance of evil, and finds, quote, clean, pure feeling living within us, that's Solzhenitsyn's phrase, awakening us to the transcendent reality that is the source of our moral intelligence. So my first question is, who is the tyrant? How is the tyrant to be identified? The answers that have been given to this question in the Western tradition fall basically into two families, what I'll call ethical tyranny and legal tyranny. Ethical tyranny doesn't mean that the tyrant's ethical, no. It means that the tyrant's ethos, his character, is understood to be the source of his tyrannical behavior. Legal tyranny, on the other hand, is a matter of definitions. A ruler or rulers are judged to be tyrannous when they break legal or constitutional rules. The first and most famous examples of the ethical understanding of tyranny comes in Plato's Republic, a book that, despite its title, is really about the tyrannic character and how to neutralize its influence. It's a comparison, in effect, between the tyrannic character and the just man of philosophy. Plato understood that with the death of traditional aristocratic morality in Greece in the generation before Socrates, the attraction of the tyrannical character, driven by the desire for wealth and status, had taken over the young men of Greece. So the Republic is a thought experiment in which Plato tries to develop a model of education that would ground governing elites in moral realities, and this ontological awareness would prevent or at least slow the corruption of their characters. In his analysis, the tyrannic character is a disorder of the soul, a state wherein human beings who should be ruled by the best thing in them, namely the divine power of reason, are instead ruled by appetites and passions. Plato believed that most people have disordered souls and therefore, given political power, are potentially tyrants. It was only by careful training in dialectic and other rational sciences, ordered in such a way as to achieve finally a vision of the good, that some persons, the philosophers, would be able to resist the tyranny in their souls. The goal of politics was to ensure that such persons held power in the polis or could imprint their wisdom and their virtue on the laws enough to restrain the wicked. All right. So the legal understanding of tyranny, the other major understanding of tyranny in the Western tradition, is rooted ultimately in the Roman Republican tradition. The Romans had a constitutional magistrate known as a dictator, whose office was founded in the early Republic to deal with particular political crises or military emergencies. I sometimes annoy people by referring to the fine old Republican office of the dictator. That gets people going. The dictator is chosen at moments of crisis, given full powers of command. His dictates could not be appealed through the judicial system, but his office also had strict limits. He could only act within the remit of his office, and he had to resign after 6 months. Dozens of figures are known to have held the office of dictator legally under the Republic, but eventually the office is abused, corrupted into tyranny during the 1st century BC in the time of Sulla, who made the streets of Rome run with blood. So Roman politics at this time, if you read Cicero's letters, for example, they display many of the features of tyrannical dysfunction that I mentioned earlier. Then Julius Caesar comes along. He has himself appointed dictator for life against the tradition, which led instantly to accusations of tyranny and elaboration by Cicero and others of constitutional arguments for opposing Caesar's power. Well, we know how that argument turned out in the short run, but the constitutional arguments against dictatorial tyranny remained in the Western literary tradition via the works of Cicero, Suetonius, Tacitus, However, the most elaborate working out of the legal definition of tyranny actually comes in the third, what I call the third age of tyranny in the Western tradition, that begins in the 13th century. Just before this time, going back really to the late 11th century, they had these institutions known as the Communes, the Comuni, city republics in Italy. These are power-sharing arrangements that were quasi-republican in character. In the course of the 13th century, they become increasingly popular from a constitutional position. But then they enter into these, there's all across Italy, there's hundreds of these comuni that enter into factional crises of various kinds. If you want to know what the atmosphere is like in the political dysfunction of the tyrannies of 13th century Italy is about, or you can read Dino Campani's Chronicle of Florence, which describes factional strife. It has a remarkable resemblance to some of the things that are going on today. So these crises, these factional crises, usually resolved by calling in a military dictator, who's called a signore, or a lord, who brought peace at the price of loss of liberty. Most famous and bloody of these tyrants is Ezzolino da Romano, whom Dante places in the seventh circle of hell. He's the symbol of tyrannic violence, of violence against neighbors. This is in Inferno 12. Yet it's also the case, you have to remember that even though many of these military dictators were brought in as signore to solve factional crises, many of them actually developed into fairly decent rulers, right? The Este and the House of Mantua and the House of Ferrara had started off as dictatorial powers, but they turned out to be fairly decent rulers in the end. And after a few generations, people forgot about the way that their power had been acquired. So what this does is it makes the issue of who is a tyrant become of intense interest to political thinkers. In the Middle Ages, political thinkers are not just theologians. We tend to read the theologians, but also the lawyers. The lawyers actually are much more active as political theorists. And they are debating this issue of who a signore is, and whether the signore is a tyrant, and what are the distinguishing signs of the tyrant. So the most famous such analysis is found in the De Tyranno of the great 14th century jurist, Bartlet Sassoferrato, a man relatively sympathetic to popular government. Bartlet gives us what still, I think, a useful way of thinking about tyranny from a legal perspective. He distinguishes two broad classes of tyranny: manifest tyranny, hidden tyranny, and then further distinguishes each of these two genera into two species based on their relationship to the legal system. So we thus get four distinct types of tyranny. You see the first two are manifest, and the last two are hidden. So A1 is ex defectu tituli, an open tyrant, basically someone has had a coup d'etat in their favor. They have no legal basis. It's just force that they acquired their position from. A2 is ex parte exercitii, is an open tyrant who's recognized as such because he abuses a legal title. And Caesar is the classic example. Caesar was a dictator legally, but then he became one illegally. This is an example, ex parte exercitii tyranny. And then the hidden forms are propter defectum tituli, where it's a disguised tyranny where you exercise power behind the scenes, right? So the famous example I can think of historically is Cosimo de' Medici, who only very occasionally held political office, but he was really controlling the Florentine political system in the 15th century from behind the scenes. And then there's propter titulum, where it's another form of disguised tyranny where you've got a legal office, but you're expanding it, you're exercising its power in unconstitutional ways. So one of the examples that springs to mind is the regulatory state, which sometimes exceeds its remit, its legal authorization by the Congress, but people don't notice it or they defend the corruption. All right, so Bartlet's analysis is intended basically to serve as a basis for a legal charge of tyranny. You could be charged with tyranny in many 15th century city-states, and in fact was commonly used as such in the 14th, 15th centuries. For constitutional thinkers, however, it also provides a structure for thinking about how tyranny could be prevented or remedied by laws and institutions. Take a look at that. I won't do just fear. All right, so there's a reaction to this legalistic way of thinking about tyranny right after the death of Bartlet among the Italian humanists of the Renaissance, who from the mid-14th century with Petrarch to the time of Machiavelli tend to dismiss legal remedies to tyranny as ineffective, or laws in general they think are not really going to prevent tyranny from breaking out. So their review represents a reversion to the Platonic and ancient philosophical view, typified by Seneca, for example, that tyranny can only really be restrained by good character or virtue, not by adherence to legal standards and tituli, well-defined legal titles to exercise authority. The laws are going to do it. They always like to quote Anacharsis, who said that the powerful are like it's like the spider's web, that the weak people are caught in the spider's web and the powerful people can cut through the webs of the law, right? Because they have the power to hire expensive lawyers. So they think that the law system is not very effective in ending tyranny. You have to have good character. So the humanists live in an age, after all, when the legal doctrine of plenitudo potestatis was co-opted by the signore, taken from the Pope and co-opted by signore, which gives the latter a perfectly legal right to oppress their people. The fact that a tyrant calls himself a king and was recognized as such by the law, to Petrarch meant nothing. Petrarch's the great founder of humanism, by the way. I should perhaps add that gloss. So in a collection of moral dialogues by Petrarch, he writes, "What else are kingdoms but yesterday's tyrannies?" Which sounds like Augustine, right? A bit like Augustine. Something bad by nature does not become good over time. A state is made legitimate by the virtue of justice, not by legal titles to rule. Only acting justly, displaying the virtue of justice, or acting out the virtue of justice, distinguishes the king from the tyrant. It's the behavior of the ruler that makes him a true lord or a tyrant, and behavior flows from character. So 2 generations later, this is a general humanist position. They're all saying this. 2 generations later, Padre Bracciolini declares roundly in his De Infelicitate Principum on the happiness of princes. He says, his main interlocutor says, "I don't know who these men are you're calling tyrants. We know this for sure, that some tyrants exercised a power that was better and more just towards their subjects than that of kings. A king is to be recognized not by the name, but by the deed." So in general, the humanists were indifferent to formal titles to rule. They focused on the virtue and wisdom of rulers, a convenient position in the Renaissance when so many rulers had illegitimate titles. So the extreme expression of this attitude comes with the translation of a pseudo-text, the Letters of Phalus, in the mid-400 by the humanist Francesco Griffolini of Arezzo. Phalus was a tyrant of the 5th century BC, a Greek tyrant of the 5th century BC who was famous for seizing power in a coup. He was the one, according to Diogenes Laertius, who invented political surveillance. If you're looking for a patron anti-saint of surveillance, you can use Phalus. And he also was a byword for his spectacular torture of political opponents in the Bull of Phalus. It's kind of a philosophical example that's constantly brought up by Cicero and other people, that when Phalus really wanted to make an example of someone, he put them inside a bronze bull, which had holes in it, and they'd light a fire, and his screams would be converted to music, right? So this is particularly cruel punishment, which is always used as an extreme example by philosophers, Seneca, Cicero, they'll use it. So he's famous for these spectacular tortures. But when Griffolini read the Letters of Phalus, which in fact are later fakes, but people didn't know this until the late 17th century, till Bentley, that they were fakes. They thought they were genuine. So Griffolini reads these letters, and he discovers in them a man of virtue and piety, a just ruler who loved literary study and the muses, and you can always get a humanist on side by loving the humanities, So Griffalini's Latin translation of the letters becomes phenomenally popular. There are hundreds of manuscripts. There are 32 editions before 1500, which is very good for a pre-modern classical text. It's read as a kind of mirror of tyrants, a guide book on how a tyrant can hold power and be respected, even loved. The Letters of Phalus, along with Xenophon's Hiero, which is also a very popular text, hundreds of manuscripts, prepared the ground for Machiavelli, who's famously refused to make any distinction at all between tyrants and prince in his work of that name. So what makes a prince successful is simply the way he exercised power, not the strict observance of legal or even moral norms. In modern language of political theory, this is referred to as legitimacy of exercise, performance literacy, very popular among Chinese communists. As long as the people are happy and the state is strong, no need to look very closely into the sources of power, the democratic legitimacy of the sovereign. Justice can take a back seat to GDP, national greatness. So they would have liked Machiavelli. In fact, they do like Machiavelli. He's very widely studied in what's known as the Central Party School of the People's Republic of China. I have students who have been looking for years for the Central Party School, but I think they would be disappointed at the one outside of Beijing. Anyway, so Machiavelli brings us to the second big question. First question is, who's the tyrant? Second big question is, what point, whether and at what point, should the tyrant be resisted? Okay? Is the tyrant's rule always a bad thing? That's a slightly more insidious version of this question. And the problem is actually alluded to in Bartlet's De Tyranno, when he writes the following. I'll read this because I think it's interesting. On this account, it must be known that just as one man is found rarely healthy in all respects, instead of suffering some defect in the body, so rarely is there found some government, it's a really bad translation, so rarely is there found some government in which attention is paid to the public good without exception, and in which there is not some tyranny. All governments a little bit tyrannical. For it would be more divine than human if those who rule look to their own advantage in no way, but look only to the common good. Still, we say that that is a good government and not tyrannical, where more common and public utility prevails than that proper to one who governs. But we say it's tyrannical where his own utility is attended to more. So Bartlet, with his usual common sense, is cautioning us not to fly off the handle and start conspiring revolution and tyrannicide just because of incidental injustices and self-dealing on the part of rulers. Resistance to a tyrant needs to take a lucid view of the whole picture and make a prudent judgment as to whether the violation of the common good is serious enough to warrant resistance. Very sensible, not very lawyerly in some ways. Maybe I'm maligning lawyers, but I'll allow them to malign me back during the discussion period. In fact, Bartlet is hardly the first to raise the prudential question about when to resist tyrants. The question had already been thoroughly debated in antiquity. The scholastics, Aquinas talks about it, Giles of Rome. Giles of Rome is the most important political theorist of the late Middle Ages, which is, you would never guess from looking in the bookstores because the book has never been edited or translated. But nevertheless, there are hundreds and hundreds of manuscripts and editions in the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries. So, I'm sorry, I can't help footnoting sometimes, but I will leave out these irrelevant details. All right, so a highly relevant is a rich passage of Book 5 of Aristotle's Politics. It's a very interesting passage, which Newell doesn't talk about at all. It's very weird, where the philosopher is addressing the question of how different regimes can retain power. So he goes through all the different regimes, and he comes in chapter 11 to tyranny, and he tells us that there are basically two ways that the tyrant can hold on to power. One way is to use all of the means, all too familiar to us in modern times. Aristotle says these were perfected by the tyrant Periander of Corinth. There's the three different views of Periander, and by the Persians. So the first step, if you want to hold on to your tyrannical power, is you put to death the men of spirit who might oppose you, cutting them off like overgrown ears of corn. You should then suppress what today would be called civil society, get rid of private eating clubs, associations, outlaw humanistic education. Obviously, the administration at Harvard has been reading Aristotle lately. Outlaw humanistic education, paideia. You should also be on their guard against, the tyrant has to be on their guard against anything that would build trust or courage among the political class, who should not be allowed to form friendships or even get to know each other. Everyone in his city should be forced to appear in public spaces before the palace, I think of Tiananmen Square, to let them know who's boss, right? If they are always kept down, they will learn to be humble. Here's a nice quote. The tyrant should also endeavor to find out what each of his subjects says or does, and should employ spies and send eavesdroppers to any place of resort or meeting, for fear of informers prevents people from speaking their minds, and if they do, they are more easily found out. Another art of the tyrant is to sow quarrels among the citizens. Friends should be embroiled with friends, the people with the distinguished citizens, and the rich with one another. So factionalism. Keep everybody at everybody else's throats. That'll prevent any resistance to tyranny. So the tyrant should keep his people poor and hard at work on building projects. He should multiply taxes after, quote, after the manner of Dionysius of Syracuse, who contrived that within 5 years his subjects should bring into the treasury their whole property. The tyrant should also be fond of making war to keep his people occupied and in need of his services as a war leader. He should prefer bad men and foreigners to good citizens and natives, as the former are more easily controlled. In short, the tyrant has to break the spirit of the citizens via various humiliations, create mistrust among them, and crush any signs of virtue. For the good will not let themselves be ruled despotically and are loyal to one another and to other men, end quote. So, very, very sharp analysis of tyranny, right? In other words, he has to make politics, the tyrant has to make politics, as the Greeks understood, impossible. Aristotle ends the passage, interestingly, by noting that the practices of the worst form of democracy, such as assaults on the natural family, are also found in tyrannies. All right, so that's one way the tyrant can preserve his power, by using all these traditional tyrannical techniques and destroying opposition to himself. But there's another way tyrants can secure themselves, and here's where things get interesting. Aristotle says that this other way proceeds from an almost opposite principle. As the way to destroy kingship is to make it more tyrannical, the way to save a tyranny is to make it more like a kingship. The tyrant who wants to save himself should pretend a concern for the public fisc and not waste money. He should give careful accounts so that he seems to be a servant of the public. He should be seen to collect taxes and require public services only for state purposes. He should be dignified, not harsh, cultivate the reverence of the people rather than fear. He should maintain the character of a military man to remind people of his most important function. I guess that's why tyrants dress up in military uniform all the time. He should live a temperate life, not abuse women or boys, at least in public. He should improve and adorn his city as though he were not a tyrant but a guardian of the state. Also, he should appear to be particularly earnest in the service of the gods. In other words, the tyrant should do everything a good government would do, except one thing, that he should never give the people their freedom or allow them to rule themselves. If he does that, he's no longer a tyrant. So Aristotle's channeling here, I think, the advice given to tyrants in Xenophon's dialogue, The Hiero, which is written a few decades before. Said in 474 BC, the Hiero purports to be a conversation between the tyrant Hiero of Syracuse and a member of his court, the famous poet Simonides. Hiero complains about the miseries of being a tyrant, and Simonides recommends, as a way of relieving himself from anxiety, the instrumental use of good government, which will allow him to hold on to power by winning the favor of the people. Now, many years ago, Leo Strauss famously showed how this dialogue was absorbed and transformed by Machiavelli, who thereby invented one form of modern tyranny, the type of tyranny that potentially can give people everything they want, makes them happy, fat and happy, except true freedom. And the people get peace, they get orderly government, they get prosperity, but they're kept in tutelage. They're treated as children. The use of force is kept to a minimum. The people may even be told that they're free, given some of the toys of freedom, such as the vote. This benign tyranny essentially is not evil, it's just paternalistic. The main damage that's done is to the soul. This is something Aquinas points out, by the way. His main fear about tyranny, one of his main fears about tyranny, is the damage to the soul of the tyrannical government. So the main damage is done to the soul, for without freedom and rational self-rule, full human dignity is not possible. Most people don't care about that, however, as long as their lives are prosperous. They will only cause trouble if the sovereign does something stupid, such as persecute them for their religious beliefs. That sort of behavior will be felt as tyranny and will lead to vigorous resistance. But for Strauss, the significance of Machiavelli's transformation of Xenophon went much deeper. And it's very profound. I'm not a Straussian, but I think this is a very profound observation of Strauss. When the true philosopher enters the service of the tyrant, when he places contemplative reason, which in antiquity includes science, right, at the service of the state, aiming naively to make the world a better place, he does so at the cost of destroying the autonomy and real inner value of the philosophical life. The philosopher becomes an ideologue, a peddler of theories and policies. Machiavelli for Strauss thus represents the beginnings of modern political philosophy, or modern political science really, where philosophers, instead of trying to live a higher form of life, the philosophical life, devote themselves instead to changing the world, making it more rational, more homogeneous, more equal, and therefore they think better. So the tragic irony, of course, is that they end up causing the worst form of tyranny, modern ideological tyranny. All right. So now I've come to my third question. And third of the last three questions I plan to address, the question of whether modern tyranny is something distinct from ancient and medieval forebears. So I hope that the foregoing analysis will help to clarify what's new in the tyranny of modern times. And here I'm going to follow Waller Newell to some extent, maintain that the extreme 20th century form of tyranny, totalitarianism, bears some resemblance to the malign form of pre-modern tyranny, especially in the political culture that it encourages. There are some resemblance between traditional tyranny. If you have read the Aristotle, it's very clear that there's a lot of analogies between modern tyranny and pre-modern tyranny. But in the end, its most important features are quite unprecedented. What's new in modern tyranny explains the extremity of political evil experienced in the last century, a form of political evil which may threaten us again if we fail to understand it and oppose it. Newell does well to call this modern tyranny millenarian tyranny. I think he got this from Eric Voegelin, but anyway, that's a useful term. He sees it as descended from millenarian movements of the late Middle Ages. There's a lot of scholarly evidence for that. In fact, it's not just Newell. Another name for it might be called ideological tyranny. That's my preferred term. The main difference from pre-modern tyranny is that the tyrants are actuated not primarily by an arrogant desire for power, status, and unlimited indulgence of their lusts, but rather by ideology. They're committed to a version of history that leads them to believe that perfect human happiness and justice can and will be achieved in this world. Let's have another slide here. Yes. Happiness and justice will be achieved when all peoples are brought to acknowledge the truth of their doctrine. In pursuit of this goal, as Solzhenitsyn again shows, any crime, any act of cruelty, any inhumanity, any offense against human dignity, including stripping people of their freedom and capacity for rational judgment, brainwashing, can be justified. The important thing is to be on the right side of history, a phrase we hear a lot in the US Congress and other Solomonic assemblies. So the first serious outbreak of this form of tyranny occurs in Western culture in the 16th and 17th centuries during the era of the religious wars. Since late antiquity, as we all know, Western polities had become used to instrumentalizing Christianity, using it as a social glue, harnessing it to the tasks of legitimation. when the religious revolt led by Luther broke out 500 years ago, exactly a few days ago, the reaction of European states was to regard doctrinal quarrels as potentially seditious. Okay? One king, one crown, no pope in our town, as they used to say in Northern Ireland. So the strategy of self-protection is what's today called confessionalization. Essentially means dividing Europe into two well-defended ideological camps, making sure everybody knows their doctrine, making sure that they're prepared to repel the enemy doctrine, and to kind of link the needs of the state with the needs of ideological correctness. So the Protestants, Catholics, and other groups had their own versions of Christianity, each determined to stamp out the other. And a century and a half of the most appalling Christian-on-Christian violence follows. Now, according to the classic Western Civ narrative, which many of us had in school, I certainly had it in school, it's in many, many Western Civ textbooks, the result of the religious wars was a violent reaction across Europe against religious dogmatism and an embrace of intellectual and religious freedom by educated Europeans by the end of the 17th century in a movement that comes to be called the Enlightenment. This is the standard narrative Western Civ. This led in turn, according to the triumphalist narrative of modernity, to a supersession of religion in general, and I'm borrowing this term supersessionism from Brad Gregory, the substitution of science for superstition. That's one of the aims of the radical Enlightenment. So this narrative is, I think, now being dismantled by new scholarship. It leaves quite a bit to be desired. It focuses on only the radical Enlightenment. In fact, much bigger Enlightenment. Most of the people who saw themselves as involved in the movement to reform politics and religion in the 18th century were Christians and not atheists. Atheists are a tiny minority. So the modern Enlightenment is much larger than the radical Enlightenment, which gets all the attention in the books. In fact, the rejection of force and violence by national churches in the name of religion had begun well before the Enlightenment, led not only by Jansenists, but by many faithful Catholics and Protestants who became convinced of the positive need for toleration in order for true inner Christianity to flourish. The man whose face you're looking at here is Ulrich Lehne, who's written a book and then an edited collection on the Catholic Enlightenment. It's rather interesting stuff. He tries to talk about the role of Catholics in reforming the Christian religion, reforming politics. There's a recent book also I have up here by Nicole Reinhardt called Voices of Conscience, which shows how the confessors of Catholic monarchs, the French and Spanish monarch, gradually abandoned the view that to be a Catholic monarch required you to be a persecutor and to force consciences. So one of the things that's interesting happened is the famous teaching of Augustine in Sermon 93 against the Donatists on the text compelle intrare, go out into the highways and byways and compel them to come in. This was commonly used in the mid-17th century to justify religious coercion. There's a famous sermon of Bossuet at the Edict of Nantes, right, where there's talks about why we have to revoke the Edict of Nantes, and they cite this text of Augustine. What happens in the Catholic Enlightenment is this text gets reinterpreted interesting ways. I think actually a much better interpretation of Augustine than the 17th century one. So the Catholic thinkers of the Enlightenment explain that Augustine had only justified legal restraints on worship in order to guarantee that Christians could consider the truth of Catholicism in full freedom, apart from environments that reinforced their unconsidered prejudices and laziness and attached false information and calumny. So they see Augustine as someone who's trying to create the conditions of freedom for true religious belief in Sermon 93, which, if you read it, I recommend it. It's actually a very important, profound text on religious coercion. I think that these people are on the right track. Thus, Augustine's authority could be used to establish conditions of instruction so that his subjects, king's subjects, were enabled to consider the arguments of all sects in freedom. In short, not just atheists, but Catholic and other Christians too learned lessons from the religious wars. As a result, the practice of Christianity was reformed for the better, disentangling religion from servitude to the state, and freeing it to be the conscience of statesmen rather than their tool. The church nowadays, of course, condemns as tyranny any infringement of religious freedom, as is very clearly stated in Article 3 of the Second Vatican Council's Declaration on Religious Freedom, Dignitatis Humanae. In Article 3, I'll just read it to you because it's a wonderful statement. Truth is to be sought after in a manner proper to the dignity of the human person and his social nature. The inquiry is to be free, carried on with the aid of teaching or instruction, communication and dialogue, in the course of which men explain to one another the truth they have discovered or think they have discovered in order thus to assist one another in the quest for truth. And there's a related encyclical, comes out about the same time in John the 23rd, very nice, clear statement of religious freedom, the basis for why we need religious freedom. On his part, man perceives and acknowledges the imperatives of the divine law through the mediation of conscience. In all his activity, a man is bound to follow his conscience in order that he may come to God, the end and purpose of his life. It follows that he is not to be forced to act in a manner contrary to his conscience, nor, on the other hand, is to be restrained from acting in accordance with his conscience, especially in matters religious. The reason is that the exercise of religion of its very nature consists before all else in those internal, voluntary, and free acts whereby man sets the course of his life directly towards God. No merely human power can either command or prohibit acts of this kind. Very clear statement. So the modern doctrine of the church on freedom of conscience is, in essence, I think, the product of Enlightenment Christianity, the fruit of hard, centuries-long experience, namely experience of the dangers of religious fanaticism placed in the surface of the state. Thanks to this experience, the church has learned to state clearly that it's a violation of human dignity for political coercion to be used to force consciences or limit their freedom to choose. So, in my view, this narrative of Western Civ is somewhat backward, and it's the Christians who learned the lessons of the wars of religion, but the secular intellectuals who did not. And it's the secular intellectuals who turned into new totalitarians in the 19th and 20th centuries. All right, so getting back to the subject of modern tyranny, we need to invoke Hankins's law. Hankins's law is the conservation of fanaticism, okay, which holds that when people are no longer able to be fanatical about religion, they'll be fanatical about something else. Especially applies to intellectuals. So this is what happened in Europe during the 19th century after the French Revolution. Instead of religious doctrine, radical intellectuals began to be fanatical about science. Advanced thinkers of the time believed science to have demonstrated that the laws of nature carried no moral vectors, that human beings were therefore free to manipulate them so as to fulfill their own desires. We could be tyrants over nature. Such a belief was, of course, not a valid inference from any concrete scientific discovery, but a kind of secular religion has been called scientism, as defined by Leon Kass, this great thinker on these issues. He calls scientism a quasi-religious faith, that scientific knowledge is the only knowledge worthy of the name, that scientific knowledge gives you an exhaustive account of the way things are, that science will transcend all the limitations of our human condition, all of our miseries. Scientism's primary goal is to put the final nail in the rule of revealed religion, but scientism's hammer also hits the traditional humanistic understanding of the special place of the human being, of the importance of soul, of inwardness, and purposiveness. All right, so it's scientism that provides the true impetus behind modern ideological tyranny, whether the scientific materialism of Marx or the scientific racism of the Nazis, or other noxious scientisms to certain knowledge that touch on the realm of politics today. It's scientism's narrative which assimilates political progress to the very real scientific and technological progress that we make every day, which gives ideology its power. The dangers of ideological tyranny are also amplified by the universalism of the scientistic mentality. It aims to save all of humanity, even if it has to break a few eggs in the short run. Pre-modern Christian regimes and theologies never believed that all members of societies, or even all members of the visible church, would be saved. You remember Augustine's view on the city of God, based on the book of the Apocalypse, that 144,000 are the number of the elect. So this means that pre-modern Christian thinkers, political thinkers, were content with a legal regime that maintained order, prevented the spread of heresy, allowed the true faith to be freely taught in expectation of the last judgment. Even in More's utopia, there's quite a lot of religious freedom. Modern secular religions, by contrast, are universalist religions whose utopian or millenarian vision of the future involves converting all members of society to correct beliefs. So if there's someone out there who still believes in capitalism, the job's not done yet, right? They have to submit. So the modern utopia will not be achieved until all recognize its truth. As Robert George puts it, ordinary authorities are content to forbid people from speaking truth. Totalitarians insist on forcing people to speak untruths. Even more pernicious is the doctrine of false consciousness, which I was about to inveigh against, but I'm running out of time, so I'm going to just finish up. It's time to wind up the remarks. So I'm just going to say a few words about cures for ideological tyranny. In our country, the threat of ideological tyranny, I think, is a real one. It's getting worse. And there are likely some short-term measures that wise statesmen could use to inhibit it. More likely, we'll find sound jurists who can inhibit it. And the progress, one great thing that history teaches about progress is that progress isn't inevitable. And things look very different sometimes, even 10 years later. Sometimes I think that progressivism, radical secular, I mean good progressivism, but radical secular progressivism is not long for this world, but that's only when I've had a lot to drink. So anyway, the only really long-term solution, I think, is soulcraft, as Plato and other ancient philosophers, as well as their more recent followers, knew. And for this, we need all the resources of enlightened religion and humane education. In practice, as Leo Strauss pointed out, as the ancient philosophers' schools all knew, there are powerful forces in all human societies that seek to tyrannize their members in the realm of thought. It's important to remember that tyranny succeeds not just because of the disordered desires of tyrants, but because of the servility of those who permit themselves to be tyrannized. As educators, we need to relearn the difference between education and indoctrination, between the Socratic legacy of searching for the good, the true, and the beautiful, to complete freedom incomplete freedom, that is the ground of moral agency and human dignity, and, on the other hand, a form of education that shapes students only to be cogs in a social or economic or political machine. Those of us who are religious believers can seek comfort in the knowledge that the ultimate ontological source of human dignity, as the German theologian Robert Spemann teaches us, lies in the immortality of the soul and God's love for his creatures, and that is a hope that can never be taken away by any tyrant. Thank you.
We have time for questions. There are microphones right there, so just form a line, about 20 minutes for questions, and make sure when you approach the microphone that you tell us who you are.
I'm Nicholas Delversall from Christendom College, and I had a question concerning legal tyranny. So something I was thinking of, can we have legal tyranny in a political state where the constitutional law is fragile and it almost becomes a custom for generals and social elites to seize power? And so, for example, say Roman Empire during the 3rd century crisis, you have a constant case of emperors assassinating each other and taking power, and there's not really, the law is so fragile that it really can't stop it. And even then, the person who ends the 3rd century crisis, Diocletian, was someone who killed his predecessor to take power. So can they be called legal tyrants? And if they can't, what would we call them?
I think legal tyranny is not really a useful term in that context. You have to have some fundamental basis. Of course, they had Roman law, and they had even Roman law about tyranny, what a tyrant was, and they had Roman law about the correct procedure for electing an emperor, right? You had acclamation by the people, you had 3 or 4 conditions, which get observed throughout this period and actually get observed down to the end of the Holy Roman Empire in 1804. They're still crowning, have the acclamation of other people, they have the crowning and so on. So they evolve over time. I'm not saying it's exactly the same, but they do have these formal marks. But this is where I side with the humanists. I think that there comes a time when a legal tradition gets corrupted, right? And people don't have confidence that the laws are giving any kind of good outcomes. So in that case, people turn to other inner sources in order to fight against tyranny, because they know that, well, the great example in the late Middle Ages I alluded to very briefly is plenitudo potestatis, a term that was originally used for the Pope in the 13th century. And the jurists in different locations, most famously Milan, seize on this doctrine and declare that all the princes have plenitudo potestatis, which essentially gives them carte blanche to do anything legally. And that's the environment these humanists are saying, no, law is not enough. I don't say my point, generally speaking, is that the prohibitions against legal tyranny only work when you have a sound legal system. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hankins. I'm Haydn Liu from Columbia University.
Good place.
Sorry?
Good place. I got my PhD there.
Thank you. I really appreciate your footnote about the sort of scientist origin of universalism. I find it very interesting.
Sorry, about what?
The scientist, the scientism's origin of universalism, that everyone needs to be,
right.
needs to agree with our side. I find the notion very interesting, like it very much, but I'm just wondering how you would respond to this imaginable challenge to that proposal, namely the origin of such a sentiment is much more to be found in the Christian religion, which, although it is not universalist, it does have this grand commission and sees evangelism as the core of its mission. And just how would you respond to someone who says it is this zeal for getting the other person to your side, which teaches us to be concerned and put our stakes in the conviction of another person?
That's right.
Yeah.
No, I understand that. I mean, this was the hard part for these 17th and 18th century Catholic monarchs, many of them very sincere Christians, when they're said, when the confessors and other political philosophers are saying to them, you got to lighten up here, you're going to have a rebellion if you keep persecuting these Protestants or Catholics, depending on where you are. And the monarch said, should I allow my subjects to go to hell, right? They're going to go to hell if I don't save them, right? And the argument that eventually works against that argument, which is played out very interestingly in these confessors' manuals for kings in the 17th century, is that you cannot be converted by such means. That conversion is a work of grace. You can't force someone to believe something. The best that a person can do is to remove the conditions that would force them that would blind them to the truth, right? This is why this letter of Augustine is so vital. I have a student who's writing a history of the interpretation of letter 93. And one of the interesting things about this is that Augustine actually aren't calling for coercion. He's not, you know the situation, they had the Donatist heretics in North Africa, he's the Bishop of Hippo, they call in the Roman soldiers to basically clear people out of Donatist churches and make them go to Catholic churches. So it's coercion. But Augustine tries to argue that it's not really coercion. What it is forcing people to listen to something other than they've always listened to, which is creating a condition for freedom. They're not holding a gun to people's head and forcing them to confess Catholicism, which would be wrong, but they are putting them in a place where they can hear the Catholic truth, right? So I think this is the argument that Christians have to be constantly aware of, that that there are no arguments for conversion, right? This is classic case is Augustine in the Confessions. The only thing that arguments can do is to remove obstacles to faith. Faith comes from other places. There's this fantastic passage in Book 8 of the Confessions where Augustine talks about his conversion, right? And he's the transcendental subject watching his will change from one to another. It's always his will, right? He's always doing it. But it's God who's taken over his life, not coercing him, but turning him, right, to the truth. And Augustine, I think, had a very good understanding of intellectuals. He understands that we're not that important, right? That all we can do is to make it easier for people, remove obstacles to belief, but actual conversion is God's job.
Thank you very much.
Don? There we go. Luke Foster from the University of Chicago. A similar possible objection, a sympathetic objection, if you will. What if you have someone say, the only real difference of modern tyranny is not its ideological dimension, but is simply its technological capacity?
Sorry, I'm really having difficulty hearing you. I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay. Better?
Yeah.
What if, posing another objection that I think comes to mind naturally with this analysis is, what if the only real distinctive feature of modern tyranny as compared to ancient is simply the technological power to coerce and surveil on a much broader scale, which would perhaps undercut the distinctiveness of this ideological, this millenarian dimension? How would you address that objection?
Did you understand that?
How would you address the objection that technology is what's decisive in the formation of
Oh,
modern
yes.
ideology?
Right. That's actually an argument that's been made a lot, in fact, in the literature, that it's technology that amplifies the power of the tyrant. And I think that's no doubt true. But it's not the ultimate explanation is a moral explanation. And I think Solzhenitsyn had it right, that ideology makes people who are doing very bad things think they're doing very good things. That's the moral condition that allows people to use the technology to make a misery of millions of people's lives.
Ryan Schinkel, St. John's College. My question is having to do with what kind of deformation is distinct in the millenarian tyrant as opposed to the deformation of the soul in whether Plato or Aquinas' accounts of ancient tyrannies. Is there anything distinctive to the ideologue who is part of the apparatus of millenarian tyranny, something new in how they're destroying their own flourishing and their own humanity?
Yes, it's a very interesting question because you can say that people are motivated by ideology, but maybe they're really just motivated by the same old thing, the desire for power, status, fear, libido dominandi, and that ideology is a kind of a mental excuse for doing what they do. However, it's a very powerful one, okay, and it's the scientistic part of ideology that gives it its power, because if you're a scientistic person, you believe that science has got the answers. If you study recent critiques of the social sciences, you'll be extremely skeptical that social scientists have any kind of knowledge whatsoever. But nevertheless, the people who are taught, we see this all the time in sort of bad environmentalism, right, where people say that the science is settled, that you can't have any disagreement from the truth, and if you do, then you should be wiped out. And this is kind of bad environmentalism as far as I'm concerned, but it's powered by the scientific idea. But behind it's the libido dominandi. I agree that human beings are the same. Human beings haven't changed, but science has changed, and the means at people's disposals have changed. I think the book, for example, and I was asking myself this night, I woke up in the middle of the night, as I frequently do, and was thinking this question about the power of intellectuals in the modern world, right? And I asked myself, is there any ancient philosopher that I could think of who is responsible for starting a war, starting a revolution, causing any kind of major political change? And I really can't think of any. The ancient philosophers, when they got involved in politics, basically trained people in schools and they whispered in ears, but they weren't ideologues who had huge effects, started revolutions, justified massive purges and destruction of large numbers of people based on ideological. I think that the ideology and the technology and the role of the intellectual have all changed in the modern world. The human heart is the same.
Dr. Hankins, thank you for your talk. I'm Birch Smith. I'm a student of philosophy and history at Hillsdale College. And my question is about your account of what seems to me the particularly interesting role of Karl Marx in this narrative of modern ideological tyranny.
Yeah.
And to me it seems sort of, I'm personally inclined to want to draw a distinction between Marx as a thinker and as a theorist who has a critique of what he sees as modern economic tyranny, who wants to revalue labor and praxis, however much we might want to criticize his notion of praxis.
Yeah.
But then on the other hand, obviously Marx's positive project, in the way that it was taken forward by his successors more or less faithfully to him, in this narrative of modern tyranny and holding this special place. So how do you balance these two sides of Marx in this account?
Yeah, thank you for the question. There's no ideology that has any power unless it has some kind of moral purchase, right? And Marx's way of understanding the effects of capitalism or the economics on the way people think is a point well taken and something that's not well taken. But I think where he goes wrong, in my view, is the idea of false consciousness, that there are people out there who just can't get it because of their economic situation. They're not able to be brought out of that. And you need a violent revolution, or you need some kind of violent change in order to change the socioeconomic situation so that people, this is Marx and not Gramsci, there's different versions of this, but, and the notion of false consciousness is a very pernicious one. And it's very similar, I was thinking about this the other day, it's very similar to the way that the Spanish in the New World justified their imperial control over the native populations there. They infantilized them, as official theory. It comes out of Aristotle, Book 1, actually, is one of the forms of authority. They just said, these people are not ready to rule themselves, so we're going to keep them, we're going to educate them, and someday maybe they'll be able to rule themselves, but not now. And the British also had the same idea in their empire. But eventually that claim became due. But in the Marxian system, the false consciousness is an affront to human dignity, I think. And it's an affront to the idea that people are moral agents that can make their own choices and that have, whose dignity actually comes from the conversation of mankind. And it treats them as some kind of automatons, ultimately. It also provokes this idea that we can do anything to people if they get in the way of the revolution, right? Because they're part of the problem, not part of the solution, as they said in the 1960s. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but okay.
Hi, my name is Jack Mulcair. I'm a law student here at Notre Dame. So you indicated that the solution to preventing a reemergence of tyranny in the future is soulcraft, and I think I agree with that, but I just have a question, which is that today we see a lot of things like transhumanism, genetic modification, virtual reality, And I think that these new technologies open up the possibility for technocratic control of consciousness itself in certain ways. So I guess my question is, how do you keep the soulcraft solution alive in that kind of technological environment?
Well, I think you have to. I mean, I don't understand. These are the technology. It's true that this new technology carries with it a kind of ideological charge, right? Even the digital humanities, which is praised widely by pretty much every university in the country, they're all into digital humanities, but there's an ideology behind it, and it's a scientific ideology. But my view of the humanities is it's making people more human, that you have to meditate on the history of the human experience. You have to read philosophy, you read literature, you read history, and you have a humane judgment. You cultivate your moral judgment, which will enable you to deal with these new technologies and see, because some of them will undoubtedly be benign and useful, good things, and some of them will be bad things. But what's dangerous to me is the assumption that anything new is good, right? That's the way people think. We abdicate our moral agency because a new technology comes along. We have to stand up and say, and look at these technologies and see, are they something that are compatible with human dignity or not? And are they compatible with our freedom or not? And we have to be loud in denouncing if they are not, but not simply throw up our hands and say, technology, we can't do anything to stop it. That's the wrong response.
Thank you. My name is Cecil. I'm here with my question, as we focus on solutions, if you would elaborate on what you think the difference between education and indoctrination is, and if that is a scale, where you think our current public education system falls on that scale.
Yeah, this will sound slightly hokey, but real education involves love and involves deep honesty. And it means the Platonic model of education, of the philosophical eros, is, I think, the true one that the master and the student discuss in a deeply serious way with deep concerns for each other's souls. What is the truth, okay? And it's a situation that's not easy in modern educational circumstances, especially large lectures are not a great way to live the life of the mind. Small groups of disciples and masters who are humble, who have Socratic humility, and understand, and who are willing to open up their own uncertainties before the students and to find the truth together. That, to me, is the model of Socratic education, which is it's non-coercive because there's a possibility for everyone to be enlightened, and even people who have deep convictions about some things will find those convictions strengthened or weakened depending on the nature of this open dialogue. I hate that word, dialogue. Bad Plato, he invented that word. Well, let's say dialogue is the wrong word because it's really a master-student dialogue where the master asks the questions. But indoctrination is going on around us all the time. There's a great difference between being intelligent and making good arguments. Any philosopher can tell you. There are all sorts of people who are smart. That's the new word in universities these days. They like people who are smart. It means they get things quickly, right? They pick up everything in the lecture. They can work the new technology. They can use all the latest buzzwords, but they can't really think. And they don't have a deep moral instinct that comes from very careful reading of important primary texts in our civilization and from a teacher that cares about them and cares about their moral formation. That's what I would say is the difference.
We have time for 2 more questions. The young lady and question we
Thank you for your talk. My name is Catherine Williams, and I study history and political science at Christendom College. My question is basically, when we speak of millenarian tyranny, and that is the ideological belief of one having the sole possession of truth, is that not fundamentally what the Catholic Church is? And if so, why is the Catholic Church not an ideological tyranny?
Well, what I'm saying is that there was ideological temptation for the Catholic Church in the 16th and 17th century. As for Protestant churches and Calvinist and Lutheran churches, everyone was trying to force people into a particular confessional framework, using the power of the state to do so, working very closely with the church. But I think that the Catholic Church learned better than some other parts of the globus intellectualis of the 17th century. He learned that this didn't work. It was counterproductive just on a practical level. It alienated people, but also you weren't getting the real converts. Sanctity and conversion are not about forcing people to repeat words of a creed. Okay, it's very useful when you're a young kid to remember the words of the creed, so you have it there for you. But conversion is something that takes place in the rational moral faculty, in the heart, right? And sanctity is something that's much more important in the end than orthodoxy, if I may say that shocking thing. It's probably, is that a heresy or not? You're an expert on heresy. I think...
They're clergy.
Okay, they're clergy room. I think that, well, as you know, there's an ancient tension, let's say, between the holy and the episcopacy, going back to early sanctity. But I really think that's true, that sanctity is what the church really needs more than anything now. And that use of the fact that Catholics have a firm belief, and they have even a dogmatic belief, in the correct sense of the word dogma, and not in the modern sense of the word dogma as sort of blind belief, is not a reason why we should be intolerant in the best sense. There's negative toleration, positive toleration, right? Negative toleration is when you're tolerant because you don't want a revolution to break out of those disaffected subjects. So you say, okay, you guys can believe whatever you want. I'm not going to persecute you. The first Edict of Nantes was that way, right? But there's also positive toleration, which means that you give people the opportunity to develop their ideas in freedom, and you preach the gospel, and you let God do his job, right? We have to remember that God is with us, right? And it doesn't depend on us to, conversion is not dependent on us, right? It's a work of divine providence. It's God's grace, and that's the fact that we have firm beliefs doesn't mean that we are then forced to force other people to our beliefs. Maybe I'm not answering your question. I don't know.
No, it didn't.
Okay.
Regardless of the practical application of the Catholic Church in today's day and age, as an institution, the Catholic Church has never not held that they do not preach the truth.
No,
They've
of course
always held
not.
that they preach the truth,
No.
and therefore, why would they not be a tyranny?
No. The Catholic. I followed Newman on the issue of Catholic doctrine. That Catholic doctrine develops, becomes conscious of itself, but it's not. Innovation is not a virtue in the Catholic tradition. I mean, innovation in the modern sense. It's what's a virtue is a deeper understanding of existing. And what the Church discovered in the Enlightenment was a result of its experience of living through this era of fanaticism. And the fanaticism was made, one man's fanaticism is another man's piety, but basically, for me, the difference between fanaticism and sanctity and piety are the role of the state, right? Or politics, or power seeking. It doesn't have to be the state. When religious belief is combined illicitly with power seeking in any way, then it becomes bad. It becomes nasty. It starts to smell. It becomes fanaticism. And we have to rely on grace to keep us from doing that. That's all I can say. Okay.
Philip Munoz, I'm here at Notre Dame on political science faculty. Thank you for your lecture, which I thought was great, and I thought the footnotes were even better. A two-part question. The first on the rise or the cause of modern tyranny, and then on the solutions. On the rise of modern tyranny, what's the relationship between ideological tyranny and the apolitical character of the Gospels? Is there a connection there? And then on the solutions, what's the role for constitutionalism? Why focus just on character, and why not limiting the authority of the state?
Well, we could take your second one first. It's a very naive view which is a very common humanist view, by the way. It goes back to antiquity, that it doesn't matter what constitution you have as long as you have virtuous people, right? That's constantly repeated in the Renaissance and also in ancient philosophy, that it doesn't matter whether it's a kingdom, an aristocracy, a polity, or popular government. What matters is the virtue of the people in charge, okay? But that's a pretty naive view, in my view, that human beings, there's a natural arc in human societies, up and down, right? Any human institution or human collective endeavor is going to describe some kind of moral arc, and it's going to decline eventually. And what prevents the decline is the law. This is something Aristotle already recognized, that we preserve wisdom and virtue through the laws, and the laws become the teacher of virtue. And I think that can be taken too far. Also, too much reliance on the law, not enough reliance on virtue. They have to be balanced out in some way. Now, the first part of your question, I forgot. I'm sorry.
The apolitical character of the Gospels.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Well, Adrian Vermeule has been talking about this recently and wanting to say that we don't have a deep political obligation to particular systems, that our real obligation is to the truth of the faith, which is certainly true, that we have a true obligation to the faith. But this is something that's been struggled with throughout Christian history. I mean, Augustine has very famous reflections on the role of Christian in a corrupt society. Is that what you're talking about?
No. Is there a causal connection between the apolitical character of the Gospels and the rise of ideological tyranny? Is that the horizon in which ideological tyranny? Why does ideological tyranny come about in the modern age and not in the ancient age? And what's the connection with Christianity?
There are Christian sects who are apolitical, but I don't think that they really. I think the ideological tyranny is coming about by the intellectuals being tempted to power and thinking they can make the world better, and not understanding that the exercise of power has to be controlled in some way by the moral sense. I'm not quite sure I'm getting your question, but the early church didn't have politics because, except for rendering unto Caesar the things that are Caesar, but when Christians become the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, they have to develop some kind of doctrine, which they do, actually a whole set of doctrines. And then when Christendom breaks up in the 16th century, that's when this whole question becomes, I think, enters into crisis, and people are not able to deal with. Christianity can no longer provide social glue. It's in fact providing social explosives. It's blowing societies apart, so they're trying to find something else to put in the place of Christianity as social glue, and they latch on to science, they latch on to reason. But it's done in this very scientific way where the real problem is a science that doesn't recognize that nature does, in fact, have lessons for us, right? There's a natural law in nature. And when the old natural laws were being exploded in the 16th and 17th century, one response is to say, well, nature doesn't have any messages. It doesn't have any vectors. There's no up and down. There's no moral messages. And so we have to make up our own. We have to be humanists. Humans have to produce their own morality. The apotheosis of this is in the present Supreme Court, which thinks everyone gets to invent their own moral values. But not everyone takes that view. There are other people, in fact, the major figures of the scientific revolution, Galileo, Leibniz, Descartes, and Newton, are all trying to find a more adequate basis for a Christian religion which can be based in science and not in dogma. That's one of the things that's going on with Galileo very clearly. He's a very devout Christian. So is Newton. So is, I think, Descartes, although people have doubted that. But they just don't think that dogma is going to provide an underpinning for the renewal of religion, which they're seeking, and the unity of religion, which they're seeking. And they think that science can.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.